Albert Einstein understood something about the soul that most people never will, and he understood it just before he died. Not the soul you learned about in Sunday school, not the ghostly essence that floats away when your body stops breathing, not the thing that gets judged and sent to heaven or hell, something else entirely. Something that took him 70 years of physics, philosophy, and relentless thinking to grasp. Something that contradicts almost everything religion has taught us about who we are. And something that, once you understand it, will change how you think about life, death, and what it means to be human. This is the story they never told you about Einstein and the soul. On April 17, 1955, Albert Einstein collapsed. His aorta was rupturing. Blood was flooding his internal cavity. Doctors rushed him to Princeton Hospital and told him they could operate. They could try to save his life. Einstein refused. He said, "I want to go when I want. It is tasteless to prolong life artificially. I have done my share. It is time to go. I will do it." Elegantly. These were not the words of a man who believed his soul would survive his body. These were not the words of someone hoping to reach heaven. These were the words of a man who had come to terms with what death actually is. But before he died, Einstein made one request. He asked for paper and pencil. Even as his body was failing, his mind refused to stop working. He had equations to write, ideas to explore, one final attempt to understand the deepest structure of reality. When Einstein died the next morning, nurses found 12 pages of handwritten notes scattered around his bed, equations, crossed-out passages, mathematical symbols that represented his final attempt to describe what he called the mind of God. But here is what most people miss. Einstein's understanding of God was inseparable from his understanding of the soul, and both contradicted everything traditional religion teaches. Let me explain what Einstein actually believed. In 1921, Einstein received a letter from a bereaved father. The man's son had died, and he was desperate for comfort. He wrote to Einstein asking whether the great physicist believed in an afterlife, whether there was any hope that his son's soul had survived. Einstein's response was startling in its honesty. He wrote, "A human being is part of the whole, called by us, the universe. He experiences himself, his thoughts and feelings, as something separated from the rest, a kind of optical delusion of his consciousness. An optical delusion." Einstein was saying that the feeling of being a separate self, a soul distinct from the body and the world, is not reality. It is an illusion created by how our minds work. We feel like we are separate. We are not. But Einstein went further. In that same letter, he wrote something even more provocative. He said, "The soul without the body is, so to speak, empty and devoid of meaning." Empty and devoid of meaning. This was Einstein's view of the disembodied soul that religion promises without a body, without a brain, without the physical processes that create consciousness. The soul is nothing. It has no content, no experience, no existence. Think about what this means. If Einstein was right, then the entire foundation of most religions collapses. The promise of heaven, the threat of hell, the idea that the real you survives the death of your body, all of it becomes meaningless. But Einstein was not being cruel. He was being honest. And his honesty was rooted in decades of scientific and philosophical thinking. In 1937, Einstein made his position even clearer. He wrote, "Body and soul are not two different things, but only two different ways of perceiving the same thing. Two different ways of perceiving the same thing." This is perhaps the most important statement Einstein ever made about the soul. He was not saying the soul does not exist. He was saying the soul and the body are the same thing, viewed from different angles. When you look in a mirror, you see your body. When you close your eyes and think, you experience your mind. But according to Einstein, these are not two separate things. They are one thing, one reality, perceived in two different ways. Your thoughts are not happening in some ghostly realm separate from your brain. Your thoughts are what your brain activity feels like from the inside. Consciousness is not added to the body. Consciousness is what complex bodies do. Einstein learned this idea from a philosopher who had been dead for 300 years. His name was Baruch Spinoza. Spinoza lived in 17th century Amsterdam. He was a lens grinder by trade and a philosopher by obsession. And his ideas were so radical that his own Jewish community excommunicated him. They cast him out and forbade anyone from coming within 6 feet of him. The document of his excommunication still exists. It was called a herem, the harshest form of Jewish excommunication. The rabbis cursed Spinoza with the curses of Joshua upon Jericho. They declared that he should be cursed by day and cursed by night, cursed when he lay down and cursed when he rose up, cursed when he went out and cursed when he came in. No one was permitted to communicate with him, either in writing or in person. No one was allowed to do him any service or read any of his writings. He was to be cut off completely from the Jewish community and from human contact itself. Spinoza was 23 years old when this happened. He spent the rest of his life in relative isolation, grinding lenses and writing philosophy. That would influence Einstein 3 centuries later. What did Spinoza believe? That was so dangerous. He believed that God and nature are the same thing, not a God who created nature from outside, not a supernatural being who intervenes in the world, but the mathematical order of existence itself, the laws of physics, the patterns that make the universe comprehensible. And Spinoza believed that mind and body, soul and matter, are not two substances, but two aspects of one substance. He called this one substance God or nature, and he argued that everything that exists, including human consciousness, is a mode of this single infinite reality. Einstein read Spinoza obsessively. He kept a copy of Spinoza's Ethics on his shelf. He quoted Spinoza throughout his life, and when asked what he believed about God, Einstein always gave the same answer. He said, "I believe in Spinoza's God, who reveals himself in the harmony of all that exists, not in a God who concerns himself with the fate and doings of mankind. A God who reveals himself in the harmony of all that exists." This was Einstein's religion, not prayer, not scripture, not the promise of personal salvation, but awe before the mathematical order of the universe. Wonder at the fact that reality follows patterns that human minds can discover. Humility before the infinite complexity that we will never fully understand. And from this religion flowed Albert Einstein's understanding of the soul. If God and nature are the same thing, then the soul and the body must also be the same thing. There is no separate spiritual realm where souls go after death. There is only the one reality, the one substance, expressing itself in infinite ways. Your consciousness is one of those ways. Your thoughts, your feelings, your sense of being you, all of it is the universe, experiencing itself through your particular configuration of matter. When that configuration dissolves, when your body dies, the universe does not lose anything. The patterns that made you possible continue in other forms. The atoms that composed your brain scatter and become part of other things. The information that was you disperses into the infinite whole. Is this immortality? In a sense, yes. You were never separate from the universe. To begin with, you cannot lose what you never had. The illusion of separation dissolves, but the reality that created that illusion continues forever. Now, this is where Albert Einstein's view becomes difficult to categorize. He was not a traditional religious believer. He rejected the personal God who answers prayers. He rejected heaven and hell. He rejected the soul that survives the body and gets judged for its deeds. But Albert Einstein was also not a typical atheist. He was frustrated when atheists claimed him as one of their own. He said, "What separates me from most so-called atheists is a feeling of utter humility toward the unattainable secrets of the harmony of the cosmos." Utter humility. Most atheists, Albert Einstein believed, were too confident. They rejected the small god of religion and thought they had answered the question. But Albert Einstein saw that rejecting a childish image of God was only the beginning. Beyond that rejection was an infinite mystery that demanded reverence. The universe exists. It follows mathematical laws. Human minds can discover those laws. These facts, Albert Einstein believed, were more miraculous than any religion had imagined. The mystery was not solved by rejecting God. The mystery was deepened, and within that mystery, the question of the soul remained, not the simple question of whether it survives death, but the deeper question of what it actually is. What is this awareness that looks out through your eyes? What is this experience of being someone, and how does it arise from matter that seems to have no experience at all? Albert Einstein did not have final answers to these questions, but he had a framework, Baruch Spinoza's framework, the framework that says mind and matter are two aspects of one reality, and that this reality is God, or nature, or the cosmos itself. Albert Einstein hinted at this understanding in his famous letter about his friend, Walter Bennet. Walter Bennet died in March 1955, just weeks before Albert Einstein himself. Albert Einstein wrote to Walter Bennet's family with words that have become legendary. He said, "Now he has departed from this strange world a little ahead of me. That means nothing. People like us who believe in physics know that the distinction between past, present, and future is only a stubbornly persistent illusion." A stubbornly persistent illusion. Albert Einstein was not offering empty comfort. He was stating what his own physics had revealed. In the four-dimensional space-time of relativity theory, there is no universal now. The past and future are not fundamentally different. From the present, they all exist together in the block universe that Albert Einstein's equations describe. If this is true, then Walter Bennet's life was not erased by death. It exists eternally in the fabric of space-time. Every moment Walter Bennet ever lived is still there, fixed in the mathematical structure of reality. Death is not the end of existence. It is simply the boundary of one particular story within the larger whole. And the same would be true for Albert Einstein and for you. Modern neuroscience has begun to confirm what Albert Einstein intuited a century ago. We now know that consciousness is not a separate thing, added to the brain. It is what the brain does. When you think, neurons fire. When you feel, chemicals release. When you experience the color red, or the taste of coffee, or the feeling of love, specific patterns of electrical activity create those experiences, damage the brain in specific ways, and specific experiences disappear, damage the visual cortex, and you lose the ability to see, damage the hippocampus, and you lose the ability to form new memories, damage the prefrontal cortex, and your personality changes, sometimes radically. This is not evidence against the soul. It is evidence that Albert Einstein's view was correct. The soul and the body are not two things. They are one thing. Damage the body, and you damage the soul, because they were never separate to begin with. Some people find this frightening. If the soul is just the body, viewed from inside, then the soul dies. When the body dies, there is no escape, no continuation, no personal survival. But Albert Einstein found this liberating because it meant the soul was never trapped in the body. It was never a prisoner waiting to be freed. The soul is the body's way of experiencing itself, and while that experience ends, when the body ends, it was never less than a miracle while it lasted. Every moment of consciousness is the universe, aware of itself. Every thought is matter, contemplating matter. Every feeling of love, or wonder, or fear is the cosmos, experiencing something that physics alone cannot describe. The soul without the body is empty, but the soul with the body is everything. But here is where Albert Einstein's understanding becomes even more profound. In 1930, Albert Einstein published an essay called What I Believe. It was his most personal statement about life, death, and meaning, and it contained a passage that reveals the full depth of his thinking about the soul. He wrote, "I am satisfied with the mystery of life's eternity and with the awareness of and glimpse into the marvelous construction of the existing world, together with the devoted striving to comprehend a portion, however tiny, of the reason that manifests itself in nature, the mystery of life's eternity." Albert Einstein did not believe in personal immortality. He did not believe his individual consciousness would survive his body. But he believed in something else, something he called eternity, something that transcended the boundaries of individual life and death. This eternity was not endless duration. It was not living forever as yourself. It was the recognition that the self was always an illusion, that the real you, the deep you, was never separate from the eternal patterns of the universe. When you understand this, death changes. It is no longer the annihilation of everything you are. It's the dissolution of a temporary form, a wave returning to the ocean, the note ending, but the music continuing. Albert Einstein wrote, "The fear of death is the most unjustified of all fears, for there is no risk of accident for someone who is dead." This wasn't denial. This wasn't false bravado. This was the calm that comes from understanding what you actually are. You're not a soul trapped in a body, waiting to escape. You're a body that has achieved consciousness, a pattern of matter that has become aware of itself, a temporary configuration that will dissolve back into the infinite source from which it came. And that source is eternal, not because it lives forever, but because it was never trapped in time to begin with. But how does this understanding change how you live? Albert Einstein believed it changed everything. If the separate self is an illusion, then selfishness is a kind of mistake. You're not really advancing your own interests. When you harm others, you're harming yourself. because the boundaries you draw between yourself and others are not ultimately real. Albert Einstein wrote about this explicitly. He said, "Our task must be to free ourselves from this prison by widening our circle of compassion to embrace all living creatures and the whole of nature in its beauty." This wasn't vague spiritual advice. This was a logical consequence of his understanding of the soul. If you and I are both expressions of the same underlying reality, then kindness to you is kindness to myself, and cruelty to you is cruelty to the same source that created us both. Albert Einstein wasn't a saint. He failed in his personal relationships. He neglected his first wife and his sons. He could be cold and distant, but he understood that his failures weren't separate from him. They too were expressions of the universe, working through an imperfect form. This understanding brought him not guilt, but humility. He couldn't blame himself for being the configuration of matter he was, but he could strive to widen his circle of compassion, to recognize the artificial nature of the boundaries he drew between self and other. And perhaps most importantly, Albert Einstein's view changes how you face death. If you believe the soul survives the body, then death is a transition. You fear what comes next. You worry about judgment. You hope for reward. If you believe nothing survives death, then death is annihilation. You fear the void. You cling to existence. You rage against the dying of the light. But Albert Einstein's view offers a third possibility. Death is neither transition nor annihilation. Death is the end of a particular perspective. The wave returns to the ocean. The pattern dissolves into the patterns that made it possible. There's nothing to fear because there's no one to fear it. The self that fears is the very thing that ends, and what continues was never threatened to begin with. Now let me tell you what happened in Albert Einstein's final hours. After refusing surgery, Albert Einstein spent his last night on Earth, doing what he had done his whole life, thinking, writing, reaching for understanding. The nurses at Princeton Hospital watched a dying man scribble equations on paper. They didn't understand what he was writing. They couldn't know that he was attempting to unify gravity and electromagnetism into a single theory, that he was still searching for the mathematical description of reality that had eluded him for 30 years. Some people see this as tragic, the great genius dying without finding his answer, but I think Albert Einstein saw it differently. The search was the point, the reaching was the meaning. The fact that a finite mind made of ordinary matter could ask questions about the structure of the infinite, that was the miracle. Finding the answer would have been almost secondary. Albert Einstein died at 1:15 a.m. on April 18, 1955. He spoke his last words in German to a nurse who didn't understand the language. Her name was Alberta Rosel. She was alone with him in those final moments. Whatever he said was lost forever. Some have speculated about what those final words might have been, perhaps an equation, perhaps a name, perhaps a prayer to the God of Baruch Spinoza, perhaps simply an expression of wonder at what he was finally seeing as his consciousness dissolved back into the infinite whole from which it came. But perhaps that mystery is fitting. Perhaps Albert Einstein's final message wasn't meant for Eos. Perhaps it was a greeting to the mystery he was about to rejoin, an acknowledgement that the wave was returning to the ocean. What did Albert Einstein understand about the soul? Just before dying, he understood that the soul is not what you think. It's not a separate substance that exists independently of the body. It's not a ghost that will float away when you die. It's not the thing that gets judged and rewarded or punished. The soul is the body viewed from the inside, Consciousness is what complex matter and feels like to itself. Mind and body are two aspects of one reality, not two realities, mysteriously joined. And when the body dies, the soul doesn't go anywhere. It dissolves back into the source from which it came, the universe. That was temporarily experiencing itself as you, returns to experiencing itself as everything else. Is this comforting? That depends on what you're looking for. If you want the promise of personal survival, of being yourself forever in some heavenly realm, then Albert Einstein's view offers no comfort. He rejected that vision as childish, as an optical delusion that humans create to avoid facing the truth. But if you can accept that the separate self was always an illusion, then Albert Einstein's view offers something else. Peace, the peace that comes from knowing you were never separate from the infinite, that you can't lose what you never had, that the fear of death is based on a misunderstanding of what you are. Albert Einstein called this the cosmic religious feeling. He said it was the strongest and noblest motive for scientific research. He said that those who experience it feel the sublimity and marvelous order which reveal themselves in nature and want to experience the universe as a single significant whole, a single significant whole. This is what Albert Einstein understood about the soul, that it's not separate from the whole, that the boundaries we draw between self and world, between mind and matter, between life and death, are useful for navigating existence, but don't reflect ultimate reality. The soul without the body is empty and devoid of meaning, because there's no soul without the body. The two are one thing, and that one thing is a temporary expression of the eternal patterns that make everything possible. Albert Einstein spent his final hours reaching toward those patterns. He died with a pencil in his hand, still trying to write the equation that would express the underlying order of the universe. He never finished. But perhaps the unfinished search was the point. Perhaps the soul isn't something you simply find. Perhaps it's something you reach for. Forever incomplete, forever expanding, forever connected to the mystery that creates everything and is created by nothing. Comment unity if you believe Albert Einstein was right, if body and soul are one thing and the separate self is an illusion. Comment separate if you believe Albert Einstein was wrong, if the soul is something more than the body, something that survives death and continues as itself. And tell me, does Albert Einstein's view comfort you or disturb you? Does knowing that the great physicist rejected personal immortality change how you think about your own death? I read every comment in the first 2 hours. This is the conversation that matters most, because the question of the soul isn't just academic. It shapes how we live. It determines what we fear. It colors every moment with either hope or dread, or something stranger than either. Albert Einstein faced his death with calm. He refused surgery because he had done his share. He asked for paper because he still had questions to ask. He spoke his last words in a language the nurse couldn't understand, taking whatever he saw with him into the unknown. What he saw, we will never know. But what he believed, he left behind in letters and essays and the testimony of those who knew him. The soul is not what you think. The body is not a prison. Death is not an ending. And the fear we carry is based on a misunderstanding of what we are. If Albert Einstein was right, you are not a separate being who will one day cease to exist. You are the universe becoming conscious of itself through one particular form. When that form dissolves, the universe does not lose anything. It simply continues expressing itself in infinite other ways. Your thoughts right now are the cosmos thinking. Your awareness is existence becoming aware. And when your body stops functioning, the awareness does not go anywhere, because it was never located anywhere to begin with. This is what Albert Einstein understood about the soul just before dying. This is the message he left in his letters and equations, and the calm with which he faced the end. The soul is not what you think. It is something far stranger and far more beautiful and far more eternal than any religion has ever dared to imagine.